It's time for Deja Vu in Map 13. Jill enters yet another puzzle. If I'm being honest, I'm a little disappointed in this one. It has to be the shortest map thus far, not so much puzzles as a trek up and out. While it introduces the frog form, it doesn't explore the form's benefit of trekking through water and land, so it just comes across as a worse form. Judging by the map's name, I'm guessing it was produced as filler rather than to create anything genuinely compelling. I don't have too much to say about this map as it's literally only ants and platforming. What is there to say? It's time to look for a quest giver in Map 3-2. Jill roams through the village. If this is supposed to be a village, then I never want to live there because it's full of firebirds, bouncy death balls, and has an unkillable demon in it. It's pretty much just a trek to the key and then backtracking to the start. It has length, but it still manages to feel too short because it seems too simplistic. In many ways, it's like the worst of Jill's worst maps rolled into one, too simple and linear, and it doesn't even end in a fast manner. There's no puzzles or tricks, just bouncy walls, awkwardly placed firebirds, and a demon that the included knives can't really kill. It's time to try for enlightenment. In Map 310, Jill tries her luck in the pyramid puzzle. Though this really isn't saying much, I'd consider it the much better version of Map 113 due to actually using the frog form better and having more to it. Though completely lacking in enemies, you at least use the frog form to go through water, which emphasizes its upside as amphibious. You also have some blocks to get through, though that's not really saying much, and the Firebird trek to the gym is also very short. At least there's more of visually pleasing outdoors, but for some reason you can't leave as the Firebird, forcing you to backtrack if you didn't turn human. While it may be a better use of the Firebird and Frog than that other map, it's still very much lacking depth compared to the majority of maps. It's time to level out in Map 14. Jill enters the Plateau. Ironically named map, of course, because it's basically a whole lot of hills that you have to jump over with ants, firebirds, and beehives. If you're expecting Jill of the Jungle to be one of those kinds of games to have something epic for the finale, you might be a bit disappointed. The ending sequence is pretty cool, but the map itself is pretty much a short straight line, and the biggest challenge is if you want to kill everything. I'm not saying I expect some big boss monster at the end of it all, but maybe a bit more in terms of platforming and exploring. For the final map of the first episode, it left me wanting just a bit more, but maybe it's meant to be a victory for overcoming the previous maps. It's time to embrace the strange. In Map 215, Jill wanders into the land of eternal weirdness. This map feels like it relies just a bit heavily on gimmicks and doesn't really have too much going for it. Using bars to halt a firebird, going through buttons to press buttons you have to go through is the most unique part about it ultimately. It has some other things too, like sprinting through disappearing blocks and having to correctly go on buttons, but they don't feel that original. The lift puzzle was even flat out annoying, seemingly designed just to be weird to navigate through, but it wasn't anything that bad. Ultimately, the map feels a little gimmicky and not that engaging when it relies so heavily on enemy movements or otherwise time wasters, in my opinion. It's time to head to the underground in Map 1, 3-5, Jill enters the hut. You heard that right, it's 3 maps in one technically, but it just makes more sense to rank them as a collective unit. This one's a lot more linear and pressed forward than the previous two, to the point that walls drop down for the 2 other map entrances so you can't backtrack. It also introduces a few enemy types, a snake that gets smaller when hit until dead, an unkillable ghost in a path, and crabs that can climb up and down. It's interesting that it adds new things, but overall feels weirdly cramped and unremarkable compared to the previous 2 maps. I won't say it's terrible, of course, it's just lesser than what came before it, at least in my opinion. It's time for very big blocks. In Map 3A, Jill ventures into the mega puzzle. While it has some mildly puzzle elements in it, calling it a mega puzzle is greatly exaggerating its stature. It's mostly disappearing blocks, something you've no doubt seen before, and a jump power-up, nothing too thrilling. It does introduce the concept of a spinning bouncing ball to throw you for a bit of a loop, but I wouldn't consider it that wildly different. At least the disappearing blocks have just enough twist on them that it doesn't feel like a copycat of any of the previous maps per se. I'd ultimately consider it an alright map, but nothing too exciting at this stage. It's time to walk through the shadow of death. In Map 3-1, Jill enters the valley. I get that it's the first map, but it feels a little too simplistic for my liking, even compared to the first episode's starter map. The most it really has is a bit of tracking around to get around a gap or to press a switch, perhaps making it feel more complex than it is. It definitely feels shallow compared to Underground Starter, even if that one was technically 2 maps merged into one. It's especially a real shame that this is the next one after Underground's finale map if you are playing them in order, which was so good. While this is far from the worst map and it does have a bit of length and diversion to it, it ultimately feels like it could have been so much more. It's time to bunny hop for map 311. Jill leaps into level 11. As the map suggests, there's a whole lot of jumping to be had, both from the various frogs that scatter the map and you to get around obstacles. It's another gimmick map that isn't too special when you really break it down, having things you've seen before like devils and attacking knight statues. I will say, to the map's credit, it has a decent amount of length to it, but that's not to say it has anything special to it, it's just alright with the expected stuff. You can do a lot worse than just alright though, so I won't be too harsh on the map. It at least keeps you on your toes somewhat, it never got too boring. It's time to cash out on extras in map 214, Jill bounds into the bonus level. If there was ever a map I don't have that much to say about, it's definitely this one. Unlike the first bonus level, this one's just there instead of being a secret, and is much more simplistic too, just some platforms with some apples leading to an epic score item. Unless you're seriously hurting for health, which is always possible, you're only grabbing them for those sweet, sweet 12 points each. On the plus side, you can technically leave the map anytime you want, and it seems more like a recharge station than anything else, so it can afford it some leniency. Compared to a normal map though, I just can't place it all that high. It'd be more interesting if there were more puzzles involved for those optional apples. It's time to interrogate trees. In map 3-4, Jill discovers the secret forest. For the most part, this map is pretty unremarkable, just getting a key underground to navigate a forest of spikes. About the only thing to really set it apart is going fish form and swimming through a bit of water to make it back to where you started to use the key. While that's a pretty neat function, it doesn't really save the rest of the map from starting to feel cookie cutter without much thought put into it. It doesn't have anything truly frustrating, and navigating spikes provides a bit of a rush, but it's starting to bleed into other similar maps. Ultimately, it's a map that doesn't impress nor frustrate, very much a shrug from start to finish. It's time to get waterlogged. In map 3-6, Jill explores the Aqueduct. Mechanically, the map isn't anything too special, hopping around and throwing knives at frogs. However, this is a map that actually benefits greatly from its aesthetic, with water and gray brick everywhere, which looks pretty good. I'd almost compare it to the pillar maps from Duke Nukem, but Jill of the Jungle feels more dynamic in its mechanics, which helps. There was also a gate switch at the beginning that might stump you for a couple of seconds and ending up behind a locked door to get out via key. Other than that, though, it's more of the same, and I wouldn't consider it a map that really impresses with its originality. It's time to breach the walls. In map 6, Jill dashes into the castle. This one's a bit tricky to rank. It's very short and devoid of enemies, but it's clearly more exploratory based. I can see how that isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I think it's a nice break, a fairly easy map if you know how to traverse. Even the trickier key to get is very easy once you realize how you're supposed to go up it. Amusingly enough, you can also get an extra key by getting around a wall dropping down, but it doesn't really make the map easier, but just a bit faster. I don't have much else to say about this map. It's short and sweet and doesn't overstay its value, even if it's lacking in the action department. It's time to get dirty and dark. In map 2, 1-2, Jill enters the underground. What a bizarre way to introduce the second game. No proper hub world and just two maps merged into one. Because it's two maps in one, it at least has length going for it, even if it's very linear. The first one is just platforming and avoiding worms and rabbits, but the second area is more interesting, starting like a prison break. It quickly goes back to normalcy though, albeit at least with an interesting secret in the spikes leading behind the exit. Even if it feels like there isn't too much to this one, I can give it credit for feeling different enough to feel relatively fresh. It's time to get caught in the spider's web. In map 216, Jill jumps into a sticky situation. So get ready for this. This long and arduous map has two massive sections in it. The first is jumping over spikes to get more jumping power so you can jump higher and higher. The second is navigating vines so you can get all the keys to reach the exit with. Okay, so the map is actually very short, but at least it has the wrinkle of being completely unarmed and having to work your way around slugs and firebirds. Other than that, though, the map really doesn't have that much going for it. You're basically just playing the dodging game. Piccolo approved. Well, I'll give it credit, it does something in a slightly challenging way and it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's time to go underground. In map 8, Jill sneaks into Arg's dungeon. It has an interesting new concept, carving into boulders to make your way through. It's only a shame the map is over a bit too early for my liking. Even just expanding the one area with enemies and apples or something would be nice. After you get past that, just some firebirds and you're to the exit. It's not like Jill of the Jungle needs short maps either, because unlike Duke Nukem, you can save anytime you want in Jill's outing. That's not to say it's a bad map. Short at least means it doesn't wear out its welcome, but it did leave me wanting just a little more. Pretty interesting concept ultimately, and that's enough to make it at least positive. It's time to get extra and map Jill bounds into the bonus level. So its only purpose really is being a bonus map with a lot of apples for gaining more score with. At least you get to play around with 3 jump power-ups despite it not really being used for much at all. It technically has a crab enemy, but it's unkillable since you have no weapon, so it's more like an obstacle. Really though, it's a bonus level, so you can't expect too much depth here, but it was fun while it lasted. Even a system of bridges you traverse to get to the top to shut them all off and fall back down. It's short and a little odd, but you can technically leave whenever you want, so it's relatively inoffensive. It's time to get Crimson in map 210. Jill runs into the red puzzle. This map feels very much like an in-between map. It's just simple switch puzzles and it's very easy and very short when you get down to it. Despite this, I can't really hate the map either because it makes some creative use of the mechanisms, especially using alternating platforms and a boulder. I just wish there was more to it because it shows some promise for some puzzles, but the map's over before you've even really gotten started. Ultimately, it's a decent map, one I can't really despise, but the short length and ease of traversal does somewhat leave me disappointed. It's time to rise from the ashes in map 9. Jill enters the Phoenix Maze. Basically, the Firebird form is back for an entire map, albeit a relatively short one. One nice thing is it's a find a keys to exit kind of map, which means it's reasonably non-linear to a point. The ghosts also come back, but your Firebird power can actually destroy them, which is pretty cool. The main challenge is just avoiding the bodies of water since some of them are below you as you're floating back down, requiring some maneuvering. Ultimately, it's a gimmick map, but it's one that provides a nice change of pace and provided a decent amount of fun. It's time for a prison break. In map 3-9, Jill journeys into the jail. As you'd probably expect, it's framed around a jailbreak utilizing Firebird and fish forms before gaining a spinning blade to fight with. From there, it's just a matter of climbing and jumping around to get keys and flipping switches respectively. All I can say about it is it's alright. There's enough there to feel decently sized for a Jill of the Jungle map, and there's at least hidden apples to be found. While it could probably be better, you can certainly do a lot worse for maps from this game, and I'd say it's at least inoffensive when you get down to it. It's time to rock and roll, and map 1-1, Jill bounds through the boulders. As the introduction to the game, it's pretty good at introducing you to both platforming and throwing knives. While there isn't too much exploration, you can find healing apples and a high-scoring item if you search around. An alligator and firebirds provide mild enemies, with jumping frogs the trickier of the enemies. Weirdly, there's a secret area that requires navigating instant kill spikes, but it leads to nothing except maybe bragging rights. At least it's a nice diversion to add a little more to the map should you feel daring enough. Overall, it's a pretty simple map design, but at least it nicely gets you into the game's concept, so it adequately does its job. It's time for yet another forest. In map 11, Jill creeps into the dark forest. This has to be the beefiest map yet. Not that that's saying too much, but it feels longer than the other maps thus far. Mind you, there isn't anything too special here, but it interestingly has aquatic enemies visible even if water is deadly to you anyway, at least right now. Mostly the map helps to feel bigger than it is by having you backtrack to the beginning, but it's not like you have to travel too far, so I can overlook that. Ultimately, it's a map that doesn't have too much new to impress you with, but what's there is just fine, providing enough meat to not feel like it's over too quickly. It's time to hunt for prey from up above. In map 3-5, Jill bounds into the Aerie. I'm honestly not sure what to make of this map. It seems less like a traditional map and more like an advertisement for Epic Games. Something about the signpost spelling out the weird and wild world of Epic Games, and then all the apples at the end is jarring. I should say, though, that doesn't mean the map is terrible, and it even sort of seems charming in a way. While I'd rather have a more fleshed out map with challenges and branching paths, you certainly can't say it isn't fairly memorable. Much like with the bonus maps, I can forgive a breather map every now and then, and it's relatively inoffensive, even has a bit of challenge too. It's time to beware the sword. In map 10, Jill ventures into the Knight's Puzzle. Now this is where things start to get more interesting, starting out with knights that will kill you if they aren't disabled via switches. This is followed by a series of switches involving bars and, in my opinion, an improved take on ARG's Dungeons block puzzle since it has Firebirds in it. While a bit on the linear side, it feels like it has more going for it with 3 different puzzles. The worst I can say is waiting for reappearing blocks. The game also takes the time to tell you how to flip the switches since that hasn't been done before until this point. I'd say that overall this is a relatively good map, not the most open-ended, but it provides enough twists and turns to keep you on your toes. It's time to plunge into the unknown in Map 2-3. Jill enters Montezuma's castle. Talk about a marathon. This map is 5 levels in one, and I almost thought it was never going to end. Not that that's a bad thing. It starts out with a fair bit unarmed, so you have to run past Firebirds and a frog, as well as the Pac-Man ghost you can't hurt anyway. Probably has the one section I most remember from this game, which is basically just a long jump through spikes, but for some reason I remember it. My main complaint is the map is more or less a straight line, so if you want something to explore around in, you're not finding it here. Still, even if it's very guided, there's at least a lot of meat to it, so I'd overall place it into my positives than not. It's time to get waterlogged in Map 2-11-12. Jill swims to the Waterworld. Admittedly, I enjoyed the twist the map takes halfway through, going from navigating above water to swimming through it in fish form. Even if it's technically 2 different maps, it's fun having that extra twist on the same map design. It's nothing too complex other than a pretty interesting dissension of bars, but I still overall enjoyed it. I'm not sure what else I can say about this map other than it makes a good use of backtracking and manages to make it feel fresh in the halfway point. It's time to swing our machete in Map 1-2, Jill journeys into the forest. This map doesn't do anything too crazy, but it does add a few interesting concepts. Ants are basically reskinned alligators, but then you've got bees whose hives can be destroyed, but you might want to run away from the swarms. It also introduces lava and falling spikes to give you a danger from 2 different directions, pretty perilous. More interestingly, it has a jump power-up near the exit to encourage you to backtrack to get to a bonus area with goodies. While this map still isn't anything too crazy, it's nice to see some additional things, including climbable vines. It's time to beware the reptiles in Map 3-7. Jill boards the ship of the giant green lizard men. I'm conflicted on this map. It has get 3 keys and then 3 gems in any order, which I greatly approve of since it allows non-linearity. However, the titular lizard men actually kind of annoy me since they turn around if you're close and in tight spaces are impossible to dodge. I don't see too much skill involved in going off screen and hoping they navigate far enough to avoid mandatorily slamming into them. Ultimately, the map itself is good, and that's what I should judge it on. I just wish there were more opportunities for dodging the lizard men. At least it feels different, even feels like you're on a ship, which is suitably different enough. It's time to bring on the Inferno in Map 2-9. Jill descends into the depths of heck. I would make a joke about how these maps have finally gone down there for quality, but this one actually pleasantly surprised me. Introducing a major threat in the form of devils that fire projectiles at you, the beginning of the map certainly isn't afraid to make you sweat a little. In addition, it has probably the most expansive boulder break puzzle, albeit tricky to navigate. I'm just glad Jill the Jungle lets you save anywhere. You just find keys anywhere in the room, and 2 of them are even optional, adding to the feeling that it's player's choice to a certain extent. With a mix of difficulty spike, potentially speaking, and relative freedom and navigation later on, this map honestly excels above most. It's time to navigate the devil's tricks in Map 2-13. Jill drifts into the demonic maze. This is another fine 4 keys to exit in any order, which you know I'm always a big fan of, which already scores at some points with me. Most of the routes are relatively short, a devil or a firebird or what have you, but there's one notable exception in the form of a great big maze. For how simple these maps usually are, this map was surprisingly beefy, and you usually had to guess which of branching paths is the way forward. Obviously, it's relatively chill. You're not going to instantly die if you pick the wrong one, but just the raw size of it deserves some recognition. The only real complaint I have with this map is how much it shames so many others, because it shows how big and complex they're capable of being. It's time to get very hydrated in Map 12, the Underground River. You're turning into a floaty creature here too, but now its opinion towards water has been flipped where it can't live without it. Much like the Phoenix Maze, it's a fine things to open the exit, half with Jill and half with Fish-Face Jill. It controls just differently from the Firebird to feel more unique, and it has more content, so it's just a better Phoenix Maze in my opinion. Even introduces some very odd-looking slug enemies, even if they're not exactly capable fighters. It even feels less linear, which I approve of. You know how I bemoan the linear maps. Ultimately, the underground river is very refreshing, if you'll pardon the pun. It's time to be busy beavers in Map 3-3, Jill Journeys to the Dam. Dam is fitting because it's actually a damn good map. Very much feels like a follow-up on Jill Explores the Forest. Like there, you're going underground, getting a jump boost, and eventually getting a Firebird power-up. However, this makes better use of the Firebird's strengths and weaknesses, capable of surviving lava and the like but dying to any contact with water. Being able to fly over a big map, even if it's mostly empty, is also very nice to do once you gain the ability to fly and you make it to the exit in that way too. With the first two maps being duds to me, it's nice to see a genuinely good one just to give you hope for the maps to come. It's time to retread old ground in Map 7, Jill Explores the Forest. This might be the most interesting map yet, not only reintroducing the jump power-up, but having a transformation to a Firebird, enabling flight. This is only really used for skyward apples as well as a very cool spot connecting it to Map 1, but still really fun. You gain the ability to shoot fire too, but now all water kills you untouched, so maybe don't try to head back to the right area. It also introduces throwing stars, which are actually my preferred weapon since they arc down so you can kill enemies on level with you that the knife flies over. All around, this is a fun map, plenty of platforming, and even rewards you for exploring around a bit with your newfound flight powers. You'd better think fast, because it's Map 217. This might just be the most open and non-linear map yet, which I greatly approve of. It also has a real gotcha moment, but at least it's at the beginning of the map so you can throw yourself into the lava if you missed a key. After that point, you've got branching paths where you grab keys and then turn into a Firebird to collect gems in lava. It's like an expanded form of Waterworld. The puzzles are also just tricky enough to really make you think, and getting the jump power-ups at the end to finish up the episode is pretty satisfying. Technically a new enemy in the form of bats, but they're nothing you can't deal with because they just fly at your face. Overall, I'd say it's a drastically better episode finisher than the previous one. I actually really enjoyed it. It's time to reach our destination in Map 313 through 14. Jill finally discovers the castle. Technically, this map takes place in 2 areas, but that one's blank, so I'm counting it as just one map for the purposes of this ranking. So it starts out with some navigation in the first half and a key hunt to get a gem to save the prince for the second half. I will say that the game chastising you for trying to leave without the prince is really funny, and it's a cute enough ending. Jill's okay, actually getting a snicker from me. The map itself is fine, probably the best of the finale map since it has some mild challenges to it, even if it wasn't going to live up to the previous map. You can certainly do a lot worse for finale maps, and at least there's the reasonably satisfying payoff with the prince you rescue. If you think the next level is number 12, you're right. The super creative name aside, it's definitely the most challenging map in the game, with spikes and water everywhere for you to instantly die to. It's also full of plenty of regular enemies, thankfully predictable path ones like slugs, worms, and ants, and no firebirds or frogs to contend with. Ultimately, it's 2 different sets of collect keys in any order, which does give it some non-linearity, so I can applaud it on that front, and it's memorably hard. In a sea of mostly average and samey maps, this one stands out. It's the one map I remember from the game, and for very good reason, because it tests you. I only wish more maps were a bit like this. It shows what's possible with the engine and puts so many others to shame. It's time to overview this jungle-bound Jill. It's very much a mixed bag, with a lot of maps feeling samey or just too small and devoid of much new. Occasionally, though, it surprises you with one of those maps that truly shows what it's capable of, which only makes it a shame when maps feel like filler. It never reaches the level of truly appalling, thankfully, but it feels like there's so much more that could be potentially done. I feel the forms certainly could have been used more for their strengths, like rarely will the Firebird traverse lava or the frog through water. I recommend it, of course. There's still a lot of fun to be had with Jill of the Jungle, even if Epic Games sang its praise is just a bit too strongly back then.